All right, so today I have Cole Gardner, currently the director of sports science at Miami Dolphin. So, Cole, can you I know you're currently at Miami Dolphins and you used to be at Houston Texans. Can you talk a little bit about yourself, like introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first, thanks for having me on. But yeah, so I went to school at Florida State, kind of did my undergraduate, graduate degrees there. It's kind of where I got introduced to sports science, interning under who's still the director of sports science there, Jackson Schaefer at Florida State, and then got my first full-time job out of that at Penn State. Went to Penn State, worked under Josh Nelson and Mark Lewis, who are both in the NFL now. And so that's kind of how my, you know, connection or, pathway, if you will, to the Texans. Mark got a job down there. And, there was a interview process for a coordinator level role with a lot of like data collection, boots on the ground kind of position. And I did that starting 3 years ago. Spent 2 seasons with them, and then in the off season, the interview process and all that stuff goes around, and was thankful enough to put my name in the hat for the role with the Dolphins, and ended up getting that job. And starting in March of this year, joined this team under Dave Paloka, who's the director of performance. Working closely with the medical staff and the other groups, but yeah, it's just a little bit about myself.
Nice, nice. So, uh, just a quick question. Do you always want to be a sports scientist or like
Mm.
you want to be a strength coach first, then become a sports scientist?
It's a great question. So when I first went to college, I actually went to college for completely business related things like finance and like completely other end of the spectrum, not even in sports. But always had kind of like a liking for technology and data and sports and just that whole realm. And so when I got introduced to it, it was like a thing that almost seemed like foreign, like it wasn't like something that I could actually attain. And then eventually did. So like the through exposures and spent a little bit of time in like small spaces being like I was on an intern for Florida State. But we had like small coaching roles, but also just like data collection roles. And I was never a huge, lead the room kind of person. I was more so involved in like or interested in, I should say, in kind of like the data collection, analysis, utilization, like big picture planning things. And so sports science was kind of like the route I went down, get my master's, and then, you heard the pathway to where I'm at now. But I would say honestly, it was probably the front runner for most of the time.
Cool, cool. So, with all these like sports science role in like no matter college level or like pro setting,
Hmm.
and nowadays like strength coach understand how to utilize like force plate, catapult, I don't know, motion capture. Like, what do you think do you think that in the future sports science and strength and conditioning are gonna just be a one role, or like how do you differentiate yourself from other like strength coach or sports scientist?
Yeah, so I think that like naturally we want to separate things because everybody wants to kind of like own a process, right? Like just naturally human nature, we want to be the ownership of something or have the ownership of something. But I think that, you know, great, great strength coaches are able to hold conversations across many spectrums. And I think that is similar for many roles, right? Like I remembered, when I was learning and still learning every day, but learning a lot coming up, like working with the Texans, people would, when I would talk about the hopeful future roles and where I would go, they would always remind me that you don't have to be an expert in a field, but like you have to be able to sit at a table and have a discussion about things. And I think that that's kind of the way I view roles is you have specialties, but you're able to hold conversations with others that are lateral. Um, but I don't think that they'll ever just be one role because I think the volume of data that we collect, and where sports science kind of touches departments laterally at the NFL and just professional level. Like we don't just deal with performance data. There's other realms of data that is potential to be utilized in many decision making processes. So it's more than just like the day-to-day stuff in terms of training athletes and athlete development. So I think big picture wise, you kind of it's a long-winded answer, but you have to be able to hold a conversation at a table. But I don't think that it's going to be just one role, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But here's the thing though, like, um, if we go to like, I feel like basketball, like organization or even college, they want to hire people with dual credential, right?
Hmm.
They want, they want to hire people with like rehab skill set, uh, strength and conditioning, obviously, or like sports science skill set.
Yep.
So if there's like a young coach want to like get a job with those like organization, what will be some advice you would give those young coaches?
Yeah, it's really cliche, but it's just like get involved as much as you can. The only way to learn is to do things, and the only way to do things is get involved, right? Like you have to have roles that expose you to things that you're gonna fail at, and that's fine because like you're insulated by so many levels of management and people above you at the intern level that you like it's almost built for you to kind of have failures and learning processes. So getting involved is definitely first. But then I think that, like you said, like around the whole dual credential thing, like if you view the hiring process from like an organizational standpoint, like if I'm hiring someone for a strength coach role, if I can get a strength coach that maybe has also done a little bit of sports science or at least can talk about some of it, or maybe has had some experience in rehabs, like if I'm building out a group of people to do their job, if I can get more tools in that toolbox, like why would you not? It doesn't mean you're going to be asked to do that every day, but if you can, again, if you can sit at more tables and hold more conversations around topics while you also have a specialty, like it's only going to set you apart.
Cool, cool, cool. So, uh, I want to talk about like training a little bit more right now. So, from a sports science standpoint, like, how do you view like this is probably stupid, but like conditioning for players, especially football?
Yeah, so I think conditioning is an interesting one. Um, it also goes to you have like, and you can't be always victim to your environment, but we have to remember that like in the NFL, we don't necessarily get a lot of time with these players. And so you have to, some things have to naturally be taken care of by the sport itself. And I think that that's one of the things that naturally as practitioners, some of the times, and everybody's guilty of it, we kind of forget that like that's the main stimuli, and that's kind of like there's something going on there, right? And now I think using data, depending on where you're at, and trying to quantify exactly what's going on is kind of where you get to what energy system is developing, which energy systems are not developing. By watching, you're able to gather, technical and tactical skills that may be being refined or maybe aren't. Like if, so I think one, it's you have to start with your population of what your team is like, what the culture's like, understand the culture. And then once you're able to understand what practice is like, you kind of have to backwards plan, right? And once you backwards plan, now you go to the confines of the schedule that we're given. And then you start to develop systems and energy systems. I think from a conditioning standpoint, there's there's so many different modalities, in which you can develop these systems. I think it's hard to pick one. And honestly, I'm not when it comes to my role, I definitely work day to day with training and with the people who develop the training, but I'm not the practitioner that has like the final say on what the training is, if that makes sense. So I'm not really one to like I don't have a lot of hills to die on when it comes to that kind of stuff. But I think of it more systematically, like are we addressing everything? And if we're not, then I kind of see as my role to bring those conversations up.
Cool, cool. So, I mean, Uh, your role is a sports science role, and a lot of people or a lot of coaches would probably think that your day to day is like dealing with data or writing code. But when I asked you about conditioning, you brought up like the team culture, how they train. Why you start with that instead of like with like all those complicated like sports science?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, but
everybody wants to build a dashboard, right? It's all about whether you write and you use R or you write DAX and Power BI, or do you use Python? Like, do you use Tableau? That's what like because that's again that's like the final product. So that's what people see, and they think that that is what is like the deliverable, which in some case it is. It is right. Like there is a world of sports science depending on the organization you work with that a part of your role is reporting, and that's just natural. But I think that like to your question about or to your point about why that comes up first is if you don't understand like the climate and the end goal of the team that you work with, and again that's the sport, then you I don't think that you can adequately prepare athletes for that sport. And I say that watching practice is important because everyone in the NFL has a different practice schedule and a different schema, and like just like in every sport, right? Like no basketball practice is the exact same. Like there's concepts that are similar, but they're not the exact same, and priorities that tactical coaches may be emphasizing on the field are not going to be the same either. So it's important for us to know what's being said to these athletes when it comes to their actual sport, which is the ultimate step, right? In their thought process, everything else they do is to contribute to the success on the field. And so if they're being told XYZ on the field, it's very important for us to know that as kind of part of the filtering system to that success, you know? So that's kind of how my brain works around those things.
cool, cool. So I'm glad that you brought up like watching practice or watching game is important because I was actually having a conversation with another strength coach yesterday about like, well, it's definitely different because we're talking about basketball. So one of the point guard like is actually pretty good in terms like if you watch him play basketball, he's actually really good. But if you only watch like the connects on number or like the catapult number, she's like on the low end, like
Mhm.
don't really do a lot of stuff. Intensity is not high enough. So is it kind of the same with football? Because in in basketball, like a lot of guys, like a lot of point guards, they know to be at the right time at the right place, so they're more effortless. Is it the same with football?
Definitely. Yeah, I think that depending on the athlete, depending on the style of play, depending on the position, all those things go into what is then asked of them to do on the field, right? And like I try to preach to a lot of our players that because there's a lot of players that are interested in data nowadays, especially in this climate we live in. And when those opportunities do come up, it's important to understand that like practice is full of opportunities, and opportunities are not dictated by the player. And so it's like if the player is not asked to run fast or to move at a high intense threshold, those kind of things, that's fine. Again, it goes back to like understanding what the demands are from the team. But I think that it's knowing that the positional outputs and the workload of those all those metrics, right, and player tracking are not necessarily going to be indicative of success or like because to your point, right, like if the point guard knows where to be, or for us, I think of like the free safety position. If the safety knows where to be at all times, there's not a lot of pursuit. They're not going to run high speed because they're in the gaps. Like they're already in the right positions from a tactical standpoint. So physically, it's not extremely demanding on them, right? Like a cornerback who gets beat down the field now has to run very fast to catch up to the receiver who's running to the end zone and runs a lot of high speed, but tactically they were beat on the play. And so knowing that context and understanding what is being asked of them is definitely very important.
Cool. So, uh, if the data or if the number didn't show like maybe their understanding of the game, it just showed the number. How do you communicate this with the strength coach? How do you communicate this with the coaching staff?
In terms of like player tracking data,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like maybe I don't know was it like at the pro organization, but like is there sometimes like coach or strength coach think they didn't work hard enough, something like that? How do you communicate that stuff?
Yeah, for sure. I think naturally, again, like as you think about like human nature and like numbers are supposed to be high. And if somebody's lower than the other, whatever the number is, arbitrary metric, it's seen as like bad, right? Like, but then when you explain the context of like what are positional demands, what is asked of the player. So like if you take a position group in football, something like the defensive line, right? Like doesn't have a lot of high speed running. They don't have to turn and open up. And if they are asked to turn and open up, it's probably because tactically something's going wrong, right? And so I think again, it's just going back to that conversation of like what's being asked of the player. Is what being asked changing? If so, then we should see an output. Now, if you look at it from the other side of things, again, like if the output is, or if the question is being asked of the player is changing, and the outputs are not changing, like if we were asking someone to run high speed and they're not able to reach those thresholds, now I think that's when we start to have questions about like what's going on in this system. There's something off with this area if we're asking athletes to do something and they're not able to do that, right? And then you talk about fatigue and you talk about their ability to recover and all those other kind of benchmarks.
Cool, cool, cool. I love, I like this. I like this. So, um, the next question I want to ask is, I remember scrolling through my iPhone the other day and, um, I forgot who posted it, but like he said, NFL already started like 5 weeks and there's like 22 ACL injury already. And so in terms of like, and people are talking about like turf, grass, whatsoever, but
Mhm.
with all these injuries, can you kind of talk about like, uh, when it comes to like the rehab, the return to play, like how do you help the strength coach or coaching staff build the return to play protocol for these injury?
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely, I think first on the whole injury front, it's like it's very people, and we're all victim to it, but like I think we forget how many factors go into injury. And there's so much that like from both a modifiable, positional tracking, those kind of things to a non-modifiable like athlete makeup and genetic buildup, right? Like all these things contribute to injury risk, like injury incident, all these things actually happening, leading to injury, not leading to injury. There's so much that goes into it. And, but yeah, everybody deducts it to playing surface. But I wish it was a single factor, right? Like, but uh, that being said, I think when it comes to rehab, like I've had the luxury of working with two amazing medical staffs thus far in the NFL, and a continuing theme that I hear from them is like you have to treat the athlete and the way the athlete appears and how the athlete moves, right? And these things of like not necessarily the diagnosis and understanding that like movement and how the athlete is able to move, tolerate movement, how they respond acutely and chronically, and those kind of things are very important to your point question about like building progressions. And so, like specifically in my role, a lot of the times you're talking about what are the job description demands? Like if an athlete's going to play football or whatever sport it is, like if we're going to ask them to do X, how do we build backwards from where they're at now? Safely, right? But also quickly because we're trying to win games and athletes want to get back on the field and whatever sport they play, right? Like they want to get back to the competition because that's what they love. And so it's just putting together resources that allows practitioners on the day to day to kind of understand that step ladder process, and having checks and balances from like a testing standpoint, whatever testing battery you guys like each athlete has gone through prior to injury. Usually be some sort of testing battery that's conducted during rehab, right? And it's knowing that testing and monitoring circles the athlete, and it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's very much not like a you have to pass or you have to get a certain inner limb asymmetry on a metric, right? Like it's not finite. I think that's like a good word for it. It's not finite, but it contributes to the further decision making of the rehab. So it's kind of how we sit in there from like a sports science standpoint.
This is awesome. This is really awesome because I feel like nowadays, especially in like the basketball world, people do a lot of testing for testing,
Hmm.
and coaches, strength coaches do a lot of like start from whatever like the testing number shows.
Yeah.
And you kind of say like you guys start with how the athlete move, how the athlete like shows up. So can you kind of like explain a little bit more or give some like example? How would like how would you see like in terms of the movement? What kind of stuff are you looking at?
Yeah, I think so. I think that when an athletes do begin to move, you have subjective, obviously, and then objective information you can gather. Um, and back to kind of like one of the earlier points about like watching practice and watching competition, you start to learn how your athletes move, right, at each sport. And so I think that's kind of where the subjective plays in, right? If you have enough, I don't know, I think if you have enough hours, right, of like watching the athletes move prior to injury, then when they do start to move post injury, you can hopefully look for like global guarding mechanisms, right? Like very things that you would be able to notice from like a 30,000 foot view. And so I think that's kind of one edge of the sword, and the other side is like the objective monitoring. You have a lot of like movement kinematics, and you get 1080 sprints every corner you go around now. Like you have these metrics or these tools that do give you metrics around horizontal force production and kind of movement strategy, if you will. That's a dangerous world because the you have to be smart with making decisions based off of maybe not safe metrics or not solid metrics, I should say. Like you have to know what metrics on each machine are trustworthy and what you can actually make decisions based off of. But I think objectively, utilizing things like motion capture systems and like movement profiles and these 3D um, video kinematics, those kind of things like are only going to allow you to understand how the athlete's moving maybe better or worse. And then also from a training side of things, like give you weaknesses to address throughout the rehab, because the rehab process should not just be about the hamstring or the groin or whatever they injured. Yes, obviously that has to get better and we're going to address that. But at the same time, like if you have, again, it goes back to like think about the training cycle of specifically like an NFL player. You don't get 3 to 4 weeks with them uninterrupted without football ever for the most part. Like there's certain phases of the year, but not often. And so if you do get a 3 or 4 week period, and yeah, it's because he tore his hamstring, I think that it's only right by the athlete to then also address other weaknesses if we can throughout that process, right? Like from a movement, from a training perspective, um, there's just a lot of fruit that you can kind of grab that are low hanging probably just by having that one-on-one attention that you usually don't get.
Cool, cool. So, as a sports scientist, like, is this like this starting from global and then go back to like local? Is this a is this a hard process at the beginning you need to like digest or like you feel like, oh, that makes sense like right away?
Yeah, I think I think it's definitely been a process because like when I first started, uh, I was actually so when I first started, my first job at Penn State was with a lot of the Olympic sports, and so it wasn't with football. And the way we were kind of built, I mean, I should say I did maybe 5% of my job assisted with projects when it came to football, but 95% of my job was working with Olympic sports. And I say that because like with Olympic sports, obviously the resources are less than with the football team at the college level. And so it allowed me to almost have like an introductory level role or entry level role that put me at the table with the head coach of the soccer team or the lacrosse team or whatever to talk things like practice planning and like big picture views that usually like I don't get that opportunity now in the NFL just because of how big we are, and there's processes for that, but I was able to have those opportunities early on. So it challenged me to understand that force plates are important and training is important and all these things are important. But like the end of the day, it comes down to like the sport and the sport planning and that macro level view. So I would say it comes naturally based off of like how my experiences led up. Um, and then, it like challenged me to think about like how can you actually move again, it's like how can you move big rocks with like little amounts of resources?
Nice,
So
nice, nice. I love it. So you mentioned that. early on when you're at Penn State, you get to talk to those coaches, talk about like practice plan or everything. Can you like talk a little bit more about like what are those conversations like? And as a sports scientist, how like maybe not convinced, but how do you communicate with the head like the head soccer coach, like you said?
Yeah, I think so just like in the beginning, with every sports, first understanding like the climate, like you have to be around the players, the staff, the coaches, all those things. Um, and you have to be able to like at the end of the day, we're trying to get to success, right? But everybody views success as different depending on maybe the climate of the team, right? Like what the positions are, like everything. You have to understand what the coach is looking for and what the team is trying to achieve and what their kind of gold star is. Of course, everybody would love to win the championship, but not every team is at that level. And so first is understanding like where's the culture of the team. And then once you're able to understand that, spending time around the coach and the strength staff and the players and those kind of personnel, specifically like at the role in Penn State, allowed me to then know, okay, where are we at from like a big picture standpoint? Like, do we understand that like undulation in a practice week is good? Like, should practices look different? Should there be focuses tactically, technically, like those kind of things? If every practice looks the same, and they're all 2.5 hours and they do the same drills every single day, then like there's lower hanging fruit there, right? Now, if the practices are already different in duration and they're different in strategy and those kind of things, you have a much more complex kind of ecosystem. And so first is understanding where they're at. And then also knowing, like, I think it's important too that if the system works and they're successful in their sport and the athletes feel good and the athletes are getting stronger and faster and all these things, then maybe the system doesn't need to be changed, right? Like again, it's like understanding what is the need. If there's not a need, don't try to fix something. Just be of support. Um, Now, if there is a feeling from the coaching staff that athletes are tired and they're not able to perform as well on game day and X, Y, Z from a subjective tactical standpoint, then we can backwards plan and kind of look at like, okay, where's our training load at? Where's our training load bulk at? How are we, do we do too much too close to the game? Like those kind of global questions from like a fatigue standpoint, I think you start to ask yourselves. And then when it comes to, I think like, it's so funny that like the visual that I continue to use in, I'm pretty sure it was in Daniel Bove's first or Bove. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. Bove or Bove, but Daniel, who writes all the quadrant system
Oh,
books. And I remember when I first got my first job, that was one of the first books that I read and like using quadrants, I still use quadrants to this day. Like from like a visual perspective, I think is one of the easiest things for everybody to understand, right? Like putting two concepts on an X and Y axis and understanding that, okay, here's our upper echelon. This is very extreme. We don't want to go all the way here all the time, but we want to like touch those qualities in each end of the spectrum. Like I use that at Penn State. I use it to this day. I enjoy that from like a communication standpoint, from like a deliverable standpoint with coaches, strength coaches, other sports scientists. It's finding visuals that hit because that's inevitably what you're trying to do. Once you find a visual that hits, then it's a conversation. In which, as long as you're prepared for that conversation and know where you want to take the team and kind of like the planning side of things, I think that most coaches are going to be willing to do that with you.
nice, nice. So, uh, just out of curiosity, like how many teams you have to work with when you're at Penn State?
Yeah. So at Penn State, it was I think it was somewhere like seven or eight teams. Um, yeah, so there was 30 or 31 teams on campus, something like that. And it was really cool because the system that Josh Nelson, who's with the Falcons now, had set up there allowed for a different level of sports science to go to each team, right? Because obviously you don't have the same amount of resources if you can
Yeah.
add you can give everywhere. However, it doesn't mean that you can't like if a team in level three can't have force plates, that's okay. We don't have to have force plates, but we can collect session context data, right? Like how long was practice? How hard was practice? What was the weather? And then do things like surveys, right, with players. Okay, now once you collect survey data, now you have session RPE. You have an arbitrary unit with RPE times duration, right? And so now you kind of get into the world of like you're being able to paint a picture around the team without many resources invested into it because of lack of ability to invest those resources at every level, but you're supplying a sports science stimulus there that wasn't there prior. So that's a long-winded answer. I worked with like seven or eight, I think, specifically, but we supported almost everybody. We were kind of interchangeable, right? It was like a group of three, four, five of us, and then a collection of interns that did a lot of data collection too. That kind of helped the whole system build out.
Cool. So, how do you handle I know you kind of already answered that, but like, how do you handle like 6 to 7 teams at the same time? And how does the day to day like? How was the day to day like?
Yeah, so when I was there, it was a lot of again, it's a lot of like macro level planning, but also you have help. Like you can't collect the data without so there's a strength coach, right, assigned to each team, or a strength coach that covers each team. And similar to the strength coach model at the collegiate level, where you have to train two, three, maybe four teams, is the same thing with sports science, but it was just a little bit more, but we were also around less. And so from like a day-to-day perspective, you would have like I would try to attend certain practices to check in on how the practice was going, just to kind of see things, talk to that strength coach, who the strength coach is kind of acting as your boots on the ground, right? From like they're collecting the data. They're the ones, probably spending the most time with the data too. But as a sports scientist in that role, you're trying to then think, okay, big picture, how can we utilize all this data to then connect the dots with the coaching staff? So a lot of walking around campus, a lot of, going to different lifts, seeing data collection, kind of just subjective, trying to collect that subjective data, and that viewpoint data without necessarily being involved every day.
Cool. So another question about like the Penn Penn State role is, since you're not always there, how do you get buy-in from coaches when you have those conversations with them?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It's definitely it was definitely challenging, but I think that a lot of it came out of like you have to have stakeholders on your side. And I don't like to think of it as like you versus me or like side versus side, but it's important that everyone knows that we're all going towards the same thing, right? Like we're all trying to create a system that develops the best athletes and makes them feel their best on game day so that they can compete and win games, right? So like as long as everything that you try to do from a sports science standpoint, just like strength and conditioning ties back to that, then I think you're going to get buy-in, and you're going to get people to be willing to listen. And also, I think it's important to value the intangible skill sets of coaches of their sport, because not everything is black and white, not everything data driven is true. Like data can be wrong, it can be misinterpreting, just like stuff that doesn't have a number to it can also be important. And so I think just having those fluid conversations with them, and trying to have open dialogue is just where you're going to create relationships, and then interest comes from that.
Nice, nice. Uh, so earlier you talked about like Daniel Bove. Shout out to Daniel Bove. He's actually one of my close friends.
Okay.
And yeah, and like um, the book like the quadrant system is, well, if you work with track, because I work with track, and like the high day high, low day low are like the same concept like track, and it's not like a new thing, but he make it easier for people to digest.
Hmm.
But like I feel like with the young coaches nowadays, they feel like sometimes those stuff are too easy and they don't want to like really understand it. And I'm actually glad that you brought this up because like you're at the pro level and those small things like help you along. So can you like talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's like it's you can't everything you collect should have some sort of like intervention, right? Like you shouldn't collect things or try to do things if you're not going to try to change things for the better. I think there's a piece of our world that's always going to be exploratory by nature, but those are things that I see as kind of like off-season priorities, and not at the forefront when you're in season. But I think that the simple things, because at the end of the day, like as a sports scientist in an organization, you're trying to you're trying to collect information at a high level, and you're trying to disseminate it across a strength staff, a dietitians, usually multiple dietitians, an athletic training staff, sometimes a rehab staff built into that athletic training staff or into that medical staff, right? So just there, you have four groups of people that you're now trying to take the same information and get them all to understand the same concepts and kind of make sure they have the information that they need to do their job at a high level. And so if things are too complicated, like you're just not going to get people on board. Now you're always going to have like early adopters and you're going to have people that are very interested and they want to do deep dives and understand more. But like at the end of the day, with our pacing, like I need to know which players need which attention, when and why. And that's pretty much it. And that's how they view it. And so I think to your point about simplicity is it has to be simple, it has to be digestible. Otherwise, you're not going to get intervention, and then you're back to square one where nothing changed. You just collected data, overcomplicated it, and just lost everybody. You know, so it's all about the communication.
Yeah, nice, nice. So go back. I want to backtrack a little bit earlier. We've talked a little bit about like the injury, right? And like NFL people are talking about turf versus grass. And obviously like NBA season last season, there's a lot of Achilles tendon and there's coaches talk about, oh, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. But like you mentioned, like it's a lot more complicated than that. So when we see something happen, like what are some things or what are some stuff we should consider instead of like just uh turf versus grass or like do they do isometric or not?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. If they didn't do their ISOs, yeah, that's why. No, I think again, it's a lot of like I think first people from the outside that look into sports and look into injuries, like we like our entire passion, like our entire driving goal is to keep these athletes healthy and like build the best engines we can for them to do great at their job. Like that is the utmost goal. And I think that like the concept that something is not being done out of like disobedience or ignorance, if we knew something that would fix these things, we would do it, right? Like it's just sport. It's just what happens. There's inherent risk in sport. There's inherent risk in driving your car on the road, right? Like there's risk in these things that we do. And to your question about like what do we do when they do happen, right? Now we have to use them as learning opportunities and we have to collect information around those occurrences, right? Like when injuries do occur, what information can we collect from an objective, a subjective standpoint to then hopefully start to learn more about them. And I also think thinking like with your feet kind of one foot in front of you is like when the injury does happen, it's important to accept it. It's important to understand that we are now in that situation, but also looking forward, like what kind of an opportunity is this, right? You're down for 3 weeks, which no one likes to be down, right? But if you're down for 3 weeks, it's also a 3 week opportunity for you to get better at these other four things that you haven't had the time to because you're in the middle of the season. And so just continuing to like push the boat forward and kind of shape that narrative is important, especially around like long-term athletes or long-term injured athletes for sure.
Cool. Awesome. Awesome. All right. Last question before I let you go. So before like I have you on my podcast, before this conversation happened, I was actually scrolling through like your profile and obviously like you're a sports scientist, director of sports science whatsoever. And but so before this conversation happened, I was like, maybe this is a like more data-driven guy, like a usual like the sports science you see all the day, every time in campus or at the teams. But after this conversation, I feel like you have not just in terms of like connects on, not just catapult, not just force plate or like load management. You understand more about movement, even biomechanics. So, um, how do you build or how do you prepare yourself for all of those? And for those young coaches who want to be a director of sports science somewhere, like some advice for them to be like you.
Yeah, definitely. I think again, it's like getting involved. That's obviously the first one, but then also like knowing that wherever you're at, there's experts like all around you. Like if I didn't have the experiences I've had prior to the Dolphins and with the Dolphins, like I wouldn't be able to speak in these conversations around each topic, right? Like when I look back at my time at Penn State, like if I didn't get to see kind of how Josh Nelson had built out that whole system, I wouldn't have this 30,000 foot view of like why training is important, but also why there's so many other factors that go into athlete development. Like if I didn't work with Mark and Matt and Mike and the rest of the whole crew with the Texans, like I wouldn't understand strength and conditioning at the NFL level and have an exposure to like understanding how things can be individualized while also trying to play 17 football games. And then like from like the biomechanics and rehab standpoint, um, Ryan Grubbs and Ethan Gold at the Texans and Pete Ruby and Tyler's on that staff. And there's a bunch of great people there that by picking their brains and continuing to ask questions, like that's the only way you can learn and learn these different topics to then be able to have a conversation about them. But it's using the people around you, right, and continuing to ask questions and like it's the same thing here with the Dolphins now, like the medical staff with Kyle and Dave running our performance staff and the way that you see the way that people manage athletes and take care of athletes and the buy-in that they have from players at the highest level, it teaches you how to communicate with people and how to build those relationships. So backtracking to people who are young in their career is like understanding that whatever school or whatever school or private facility, wherever you're at, doesn't matter. There's people in there that are experts in their field, and there's people in there that others gravitate towards. They're gravitating towards those people for a reason. So try to pick their brains, try to collect information, try to ask questions, right? Like use them as resources. It's the only way to get involved and learn at a high level.
Cool, cool. Thank you. That's all the question I have for today.
Thank you.